what's gone on since the COVID thing has hit. As it's we were challenged up to a point, but the NBOA, upon falling into this tragic situation, immediately stepped it up and had a series of emergency meetings. And as we realized the issues that we were up against, we realized that we needed some help from professionals. And we brought on first one a person who's helped us tremendously with our messaging, with our strategy in terms of understanding how to deal with these problems. And then a few weeks later, we realized that we needed help with our messaging in terms of public relations and advocacy. And so we brought on a team of 3 people. And once we brought this team together, as recently as about 3 or 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, things really kicked in for the NBOA. For one, Lauren, can you bring up number 1, please? An article that we had written was published in Cranes. And I'm sure many of you have seen this article. We also had we're quoted in a Sun-Times editorial. Number 2, Lauren, a couple of our members from the South Side had a radio appearance, and they were on WVON radio. And if you scroll down, you'll see a show by one of our more recent, the show host is somebody that's going to be involved, Curtis Monday, but Bonita and Ebony are incredibly talented and bright real estate professionals who've been very active on the issues that we're facing. We have been at the press conference when the Solidarity Pledge was entered into, and it was very important that we, along with our industry partners, supported Mayor Lightfoot. It wasn't necessarily a slam dunk issue. We had to discuss it, but we realized that this mayor has been good to our industries, understanding our needs as landlords. And in the face of some very well-organized, very extreme views from people calling for extreme measures that would really kill our industry. So we've been at it and working diligently. We thought that when we first assembled this team of professionals that we'd need them for a couple months. The reason we're having this event tonight is that we need the assistance of these professionals at least through the year. We need to be in front of issues, and we need to advocate on behalf of neighborhood landlords. And this is very real. We were very instrumental in defeating the Matt Martin ordinance that went into the Rules Committee, where we'll likely not see life again. There will be other assaults by folks in the city council or in other parts of the city or county that think they can legislate punitive measures on landlords, thinking that that's going to solve a very challenging problem that we have. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker. And the reason I'm so excited about our speaker, who's Roger Valdez, a pro-growth advocate and a Forbes contributor from Seattle, Washington, who I've heard speak at a realtors event a couple of years ago. The reason I'm so excited to hear Mr. Valdez speak is that he's putting us back to where our roots are and to what our firm beliefs are. Roger is speaking a message about the free market and about the need to liberalize us from the constraints of unnecessary government intrusion to address the issues of housing, to provide more great, and we'll hear the message. But first I'd like to introduce Roger. Roger, welcome to Chicago virtually.
Well, thank you for having me again. I wish I could be there in person, but this is nice to see all the faces I can see.
I know there was a restaurant you said you liked here. Never heard of it. What was it called?
It's called Schwa.
All right. If anybody knows a Schwa, raise your hand. I've never heard of it. But tell us a little bit more about yourself, Roger.
I have a background that's pretty varied in government relations and in public policy. I worked in the fields of education at our state capitol for the school board association, and also in public health, and worked for the mayor of Seattle for a while in 99 and 2000, 2001. and worked in public health. And that's what I've been doing until I got involved more actively in housing and in supporting the effort to increase housing supply in Seattle. So that's where I've been for the last couple of decades.
And tell us, how have you gotten involved in this issue of pro-growth housing?
Well, initially my interest was urban planning. That was back a long time ago. And I always looked at it from an urban planning perspective in terms of density and the opportunities that were available to people living in cities to be more connected with each other, more economic opportunity, more sustainable, better for the environment, the whole bunch of reasons why people live in cities. Then we ran into opposition from neighborhood groups and from others that didn't want to see things change. And then that morphed after the downturn in 2008, 9, 10 into more of a social justice kind of a thing. And everything became about affordability. And then it's gone beyond affordability into regulating and mandating all sorts of things and trying to solve the world's problems. Using housing policy, things that housing policy didn't create, like poverty, are now expected to solve poverty. So there's a lot of different reasons for that, but we've come into a place now where we're no longer dealing just with supply and demand. We're dealing with an aggressive social movement that wants to change the way our economy works.
And I guess there's two discussions that we could have, and one is your belief system and the issues that were at the top of your in the top of your mind up until COVID, and then the issues as you see them in today's reality. I think it is important to hear of what your concerns and top issues were prior to this pandemic.
Yeah, we've been following a growing trend. Basically, the best way to sum it up is the idea that housing is a human right. And that's another way of saying that it should be like a public utility. It should be accessible to everybody in a way that it has never been. And while it sounds really good, what it means is a growing government control of the way you manage and deal with risk in your private property, and has created a myriad of problems in the rental housing space that I think we're incrementally and asymmetrically beginning to pile up in ways that are making it more and more difficult to operate. And what COVID-19 has done is to accelerate that pattern of government regulation and reach into the decisions you make as a property owner and a housing provider into who you rent to and how long they can stay there and what are the terms of the rental. And when you decide it's time for them to go, can you make that decision? So that has been increasingly problematic over the last year or two, and COVID-19 has just brought that sort of into hyperspace mode. And we're now dealing with, seems like every hour, every day, there's something new the government is trying to do because of COVID-19 that is accelerating this problem.
Well, we'll get to COVID in a minute. I'd like you to touch briefly on an issue that I'm sure you see a lot of in Seattle, and we're seeing it here in Chicago, and this is the notion of inclusionary zoning. And I know you've got strong feelings about that. Do you want to first briefly explain what that is and what your experience has been? Well,
inclusionary zoning is a movement that's been being pushed by a guy named Rick Jacobus, primarily. There's a research firm that he runs. And it goes a little something like this. Housing's getting more expensive. The reason why it's getting more expensive is because people keep building more housing, and that new housing is too expensive. And so the only way to offset the negative impacts of the new housing is to tax it by the square foot and then give that money to nonprofit organizations so they can build more housing very slowly and very inefficiently. So if that sounds insane to you, it is. That's a very restrained word for it. It's a bizarre notion, and as much as I like Rick Jacobus personally, I've called him the music man of inclusionary zoning, because he blows into town and produces 80 or 90-page reports that no human being actually reads. And the solution to all the problems of housing become all about, new housing is terrible, it just makes everything more expensive, which is completely opposite of what we know about supply and demand, which is that when we have new and more production, we have an ameliorative effect on price. And Chicago in particular, 2 years ago, prices were actually falling because of increased production and because of the availability of land. And the ironic thing about this is that once these schemes are imposed, you do get inflation because you're constraining the supply without any drop in demand. So you start to see not only housing gets harder to produce, but it gets more expensive because you have to rationalize the fees through increasing your rents of whatever you build. So it's an incredibly dangerous policy. Some cities have it, but actually what the mechanics of it are is you have to include a certain percentage of subsidized or reduced rent housing set aside in each project. And if you don't want to do that or can't make that work, you pay what's called an in lieu fee, and that money goes to fund nonprofits. In many cities, the percentage of inclusion is so low and the fees are so low that, and the area median income for the set-asides is high. So there's some cities that have a 1% requirement, and the standard is that it has to be 100% of area median income. So you'll see some schemes like that, but there's not really much of a loss to the builder. You do get some additional floor area ratio for that fee, but what we have found again and again is that the additional capacity creates risk that's not offset by what you can produce. So you have to go up higher, and that costs more money, and you're also incurring additional construction costs, that the additional rent that you can produce from the units that you can create over and above existing zoning are not enough to offset the cost. So
let me play devil's advocate with you, though. We have a city that's been largely segregated for many years. Doesn't inclusionary zoning meet and address a societal imbalance by using these forces to diversify where people live and spread it out?
Not that I've seen. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence that it has a beneficial effect in terms of what you're calling segregation. It's very difficult to substantiate that there is any sort of pattern of racial, benefit or consequence to mandatory inclusionary zoning. I mean, I think some of the argument for these measures has been that there's concentration of poverty, and that was what the Hope 6 program was supposed to address, and there was a variety of other things that were supposed to bring more African Americans, for example, into areas that were predominantly white. But what's fascinating about that is what do you call it when you have an 80% African American neighborhood that's 20% white, and it becomes 50% white? What do they call that? They call that gentrification. So this is an absurd, very anti-American trend in housing policy, which is that we're supposed to program our neighborhoods by race. It's a horrible idea. It's counter to all of our ethics and values in this country for the last 200 years. And it is fundamentally segregationist and racist. It's the notion that people should live in certain places because of the color of their skin. And that's exactly opposite of what we should be doing. So I really don't care if a neighborhood goes from 80% black to 20% black. As long as the people that are living there are happy and have economic opportunity, I think the whole idea is offensive that we would say, well, you know, some neighborhood is black, it should stay black, but another neighborhood is white and it should not stay white. It's inconsistent and bizarre, to say the least.
Tony, do you have a feeling?
It's just my opinion.
Yeah.
Oh, I was involved with the Hope 6. We were doing some of the development down in Bronzeville, and I remember that we got involved because there was a lack of minority participation in the contracts and the development of it, and we were able to do it, and it was we did the development. We were the master developers. I did that in conjunction with Wade Development back in 08, 09, when we brought units to the area. But it was an area that was already predominantly black and predominantly a lot of low-income housing was replaced there because they tore down projects in the past. But the concentration of affordable housing has been still in predominantly black neighborhoods. I haven't seen it spread into other neighborhoods around the city.
Yeah, perhaps it's not as much I mean, it's perceived often as a racial issue, but is it more of an economic issue? And does the inclusionary zoning address any societal needs in terms of diversifying affordable housing in neighborhoods that didn't have it? And is the benefit worthy of the cost that you're describing?
Yeah, when you do a cost-benefit analysis, some of my concerns are the focus of the initiatives. So the focus of the new thing they got going around the Woodlawn plan around the Obama Library. They're trying to increase the amount of affordable housing around those libraries, around the park where the library is. But if you look at Washington Park and Woodlawn and South Shore, those are some of the highest concentrations of affordable housing already in the city. So to double the efforts down in those areas, I don't know if it'll have the impact that it would have if we took a step back and looked at it as a whole. So I think that the conversations are going to continue to happen, but they need to bring in guys like us, we're some smart guys, property owners, housing providers, to be a part of the conversation so that we can work out a plan that actually does do some of the things that Raj was talking about. Yeah, we do it. We say this is the goal of it, but does it really impact us the way that we're looking for it to impact us?
Yeah, and just to put a kind of some data behind it, it wasn't a comprehensive study or longitudinal study, but I looked at our own city of Seattle, and we had in our predominantly African-American neighborhoods of the Rainier Valley, there was a claim that that there was a displacement, you know, that white people were moving into that neighborhood and they were essentially pushing out African Americans. And I thought it was maybe a ratio issue of ratio, RATIO. In other words, the population had grown and the population growth was predominantly white, so the percentage of African Americans went down. But when I looked at it, it was actually true. The population had grown, but most of the new growth was white, and most of the decrease was in African Americans. So it looked like, on the face of it, that you had thousands of white people move in and thousands of black people move out. But when you looked at the whole city, there were a couple of other neighborhoods, Delridge and Lake City, where the white population had dropped and the African American population had increased. Now, did the African Americans from the Rainier Valley move to those new neighborhoods and sort of trade places with the white people that were in Lake City and Delridge. I mean, there's no way to know that. But overall, the city is less white. Seattle is less white than it was 10 years ago. So all that it tells you is that things change. You know, neighborhoods have, there's a neighborhood in Seattle called South Park that used to be a farming community, and it was primarily Italian immigrant families that were farming in that area. It switched over and became a much more industrial community as those farmlands were sold to industrial uses. And then it transformed further into a primarily Hispanic Latino neighborhood, which is when I got involved there. And now it is primarily a mixed income community of predominantly Hispanic community and Asian American and some white community. So the bottom line is cities change over time, and the ethnic composition of neighborhoods moves around. The economic composition of neighborhoods moves around. The question is, does the city provide enough opportunity for anybody that wants to live there and thrive, or does it prevent that from happening? And our argument has always been that when you constrain housing supply, the people that are hardest hit are poor people, and poor people are disproportionately people of color. So when you create inflation through regulation, people of color suffer because they disproportionately are poor. So we've made comments on the Fair Housing Act to the federal government, you know, that describes, and I think it's true, housing policy that is restrictive on new development and construction is pretty much racist policy, because what it does is it says only people that live here now can stay here affordably, and everybody else who wants to come in is going to have to pay more. And that definitely means that it's going to be harder for people of color to succeed in a city when there's not enough housing being produced. So that's been our struggle, and I think that with mandatory inclusionary zoning and gentrification and displacement arguments, also all of those things wrap around eviction and some of those other things that we've been seeing going on as a trend. And
what about some of the rent? Like we're seeing the Fed, because same thing. My grandparents moved into West Englewood. It was a Jewish neighborhood back in the 70s. We were one of the first African-American families to move on the block. And now we're seeing more Latinx moving in. We're seeing our first Latinx family move in on the block like 5 years ago. And it's a growing population. So yeah, I think it's part of growing pains with the city. But now we're seeing this big thing to say, hey, forgive the rents for 3 months or 120 years going around the country, and no evictions, and I guess housing is a right, and it should be free until we figure this thing out. What are your take on that?
Well, that's what I've been seeing over the last year and year and a half is and we had I sort of had a list of them all. There's sort of 3 different places where this intervention about housing as human right are hitting hardest, and it's at lease up of buildings, tenancy, and then eviction. What you're seeing is elimination of, in a general sense, elimination of your ability to assess risk. So the example I use that people can understand is rental cars. You rent a car, what is it that you need to know? You need to know who that person is and what kind of a risk you're taking by letting them take your car. You also have terms of use. You can't smoke in the car. It has to be back by 8 o'clock, 24 hours later. You've got to have a full tank of gas in it or we're going to charge you. I mean, there's all sorts of things you have to do as a renter. They also want to see a driver's license. They want to be able to know that you don't have a reckless driving record. They want to know your license not suspended, because that allows them to assess whether or not they want to take a risk on you taking this very expensive asset and disappearing around the corner with it for 24 hours. Housing is the same, except in some degree it's worse because the individual is going to be in a part of your private property and they're going to be there. And the nature of tenant-landlord law is such that people have accrued over the last 100 years a lot of rights about what can and can't be done once a property owner wants that person out of that unit. Some of those are fair, and reasonable. But what we've seen in the space of not a very long period of time is a banning of credit checks in places like in Minnesota and in Minneapolis and Oakland. They're starting to look at banning the ability to look at income and in relationship to how much the rent is. They're talking about sealing previous eviction and tenancy history. There are a whole litany of things that I had in the PowerPoint of just trying to eliminate every ability for you to be able to assess, has this person been to prison? Do they have a criminal record? And all of these things are being used as an excuse to, the basis of eliminating these risk assessment tools is primarily race and class. So the idea is that because property owners and people who are housing providers are predominantly white and therefore are prone to discriminate, that the best thing we can do is to eliminate all of those measures that you typically would use to assess risk of any kind of rental property. So those things have been accelerating, and the number and nature of them have been increasing. And then we've also seen during tenancy, of course, one of the ways that you could offset, there's the PowerPoint. One of the ways you could offset that risk is to charge more money, but if there's rent control, you can't increase the cost of your housing. By the way, in this presentation, I've heard you guys use the term housing provider instead of landlord, which is a really great thing to do. So keep up that effort. Anyway, long and short of it is that if you can see this on your screen, there's a whole litany of things here that are going on. Banning of bidding sites, which is absurd. People that could go online and bid on rental property. Seattle has banned that. That's been challenged as a First Amendment violation. First in time means whoever shows up first and qualifies gets the apartment. This again was because you're discriminating against poor people of color because they're always going to show up third or fourth. And the programmer, the idea is that the rich white guy is going to show up first all the time. Or not the rich white guy, but that you're going to decide who gets the apartment based on who's white and who's rich. And the way of solving that problem was to give it to the first person that shows up. But who is the person that's most likely to show up first? Probably somebody that's white and has time to be on sites all day looking at apartment vacancies. So the notion that you could program and prevent discrimination by making the first person that shows up the person that you rent to is absurd, but they passed it anyway, and that's a growing trend, and that was defeated, and that was not allowed cert in the Supreme Court. So you're probably going to see more of those first in time legislation popping up, which means whoever shows up first that meets your qualifications, you by law have to rent to that person. You can't rent to the third person. That might be a person of color who you would rather rent to that person because you want to take a risk on that person rather than the first person that shows up. You can't do that anymore.
Okay, so Roger, I wish we had a lot more time. We're going to run beyond 7 o'clock because we got a late start, and I'd like to try to run until 7:15.
Yeah, you can turn off the PowerPoint, but I just want, maybe Lauren can send that to people, but
Sure.
it documents what's been going on. And the long and short of the kind of PowerPoint presentation is that what we're seeing in the United States right now is an acceleration of all of those things. So when you look at that PowerPoint and you see all the things that have been going on across the country, all of those things are happening now under executive fiat by mayors and governors just issuing orders, or they're being passed as emergency measures by legislative bodies like state legislatures or city councils. So
Well, so you've taken us right to the March 17th-ish or so in Chicago, because we've been seeing these type of initiatives one after another. Just cause housing, we saw the just housing ordinance with the evictions, or with the criminal background. We're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff that you're describing. And so we could have had this wonderful hour-long discussion about this, but now we put another layer onto it, and we need to talk about the COVID situation and your line of thinking and your logic, which I think is tremendous. And how do we apply it to today's situation with all the issues that we have, including the eviction moratorium, et cetera? So help us into what we're dealing with right now.
And you brought up a concept on our call about the elective non-payer. Make sure you talk a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so our message to and what NBOA and all of the real estate community in Chicago and Illinois and across the country, from somebody that's renting a back bedroom in their house to a 15,000 unit provider, needs to be, first and foremost, let all the eviction bans expire. What eviction bans have done is they have encouraged people, which is a totally rational thing, to not pay rent. If you're worried about losing your job in 6 weeks, you're a minimum wage worker, you're on the bubble, you're not sure you're going to have a job, and the governor or the mayor bans eviction, what that tells you is maybe I shouldn't pay my rent this month and hang on to that cash in case things get ugly 6 weeks from now or 8 weeks from now. So we've started to see a growth in what we call elective non-payers, which is people who have income but are not paying their rent, primarily because they're concerned about loss of income. And so they're not paying their rent, but they can pay their rent. And so one provider had a delinquency rate of about 12% across 4,000 units, and about half of that 12% was people that had income and said, yeah, I've got a job, but I'm not going to pay rent because the governor says I don't have to. So it's very important to advocate and document to the degree that you can the argument that the eviction bans are encouraging people to hold back their rent. What does that do? It creates a bigger delinquency problem. So it creates a challenge for many housing providers who can maybe sustain that for a month, but 2 or 3 months into this crisis, if they're seeing 10 and 15% delinquency rates, and if they have commercial property as well, and those are down to 20% collection, you're going to start to see people cut back, lay people off, not hiring, and you're going to start to see negative effects in the secondary and tertiary housing economy from landscaping companies and other maintenance companies. Roofs won't get repaired. Eventually, vacancies won't get filled because it costs money to turn over a unit. You'll just mothball those units and won't turn them over because you don't know whether the person that's going to move in there is going to pay the rent, and there's no way to get them out of there if they don't. So the elective non-payer problem is one that we're trying to be sure everybody is addressing. And the way that we stop that fire from burning is kill the eviction bans as quickly as possible. The next thing that you need to advocate for is paying down those delinquencies. I was just on the phone with our governor's office today, reminding them that delinquency is going to grow. And that means bad credit. It means inability to pay those from a lot of people who are going to be faced with $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 in back rent, and they're going to have a big incentive to walk away from that problem and to leave their tenancy halfway through their lease, or when the lease is over, and not pay that. And we started to see that as well, is people are walking away from tenancies without paying back rent. So all of this is going to be a time bomb in the future for the industry, when all of those delinquencies finally start to build up. And that's going to mean loss of property tax. It's going to mean, again, more layoffs and potentially more foreclosures and bank takeovers of a lot of housing that can no longer pay their mortgages or their service their debt. So that's why we're urging everybody to begin the process of talking to elected officials at the federal, state, and local level. Stop those bans. Start looking at the delinquency and how we're going to pay that down, so that that residents can feel encouraged and not discouraged by their delinquent rent. And then we need to develop an insurance program so that the next wave of COVID-19 closings, should they come, has an unemployment insurance-like program for people to file quickly for loss of income, to file and say, I've lost my income because of COVID-19. I need help paying my rent, and that we get rent money to those people as quickly as possible, not eviction bans. So we don't want to do this again. That's one of the key messages that, again, your Congress people, your mayor, your governor need to hear in a coordinated fashion, which is, let's make sure that in the second wave of this thing, if one comes and we have to close the economy again, that rent assistance goes out very quickly, and we don't have to deal with this delinquency buildup again in the future, because we'll barely have paid it down to begin with if it happens again. So that's more or less the pitch I think folks have to make to local government and state and federal government.
Well, what about people who are legitimate victims of the COVID? They've lost their job. They perhaps are suffering from their own, aren't they unintended victims, and ought they not be getting, where's the help? Are they entitled by society for help? And should they be assisted if they're being ordered to stay at home and they lost their job? Does that justify a moratorium, or what kind of action should be taken to address this crisis?
Well, the COVID-19 response, shutting down the economy, is a public health intervention that has created an income problem, not an eviction problem. Housing providers don't want to evict en masse all of their tenants because of this problem. It's just the opposite. What you want to do is you want to make sure that folks that suddenly lost all their income overnight have an opportunity to become sustainable again and be able to keep their tenancy and pay their rent. But because of the nature of the culture that we live in today, the assumption is that all the income that you're earning from rental property is passive income, that you just go to the post office box on the second of the month and collect all your rent checks and deposit them, and go back to polishing your Rolls Royce. And we all know that that's not true, but the perception is that this is income that you can just forego with no consequence. And so as a result, the immediate reaction is, well, let's ban eviction. And I've often said, that if the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois, if Godzilla walked out of the lake and started attacking the Loop, they'd ban eviction. That would be the first thing they would do. And you'd say, well, it has nothing to do with Godzilla. We need to bring the Air Force in and bomb him and make him stop knocking down buildings. They can't think creatively, so they need to stop. And we need to, in a unified way, say this is about income. We don't want to evict anybody. If a waiter loses their job, or bartender loses her job, she needs a check to replace that income. And we're willing, I think everybody here is willing to eat some loss in the short term, if we can keep people housed and paying their paying their rent on a lease into the future. You don't want to have a third of your units vacant and then have to lease those up in a post-COVID economy. So, we need to do a better job of explaining that to elected officials that, nobody wants to evict anybody. What we want to do is give people sustainable income so that they can hold on to what they've got. And then when this thing clears up and they get back to work, that they can continue to pay rent and hopefully pay down a portion of the delinquent rent that they have.
So in Seattle, you guys are ahead of us in terms of your response to this crisis, and your politics are notably a little bit ahead of us in terms of the kind of radical solutions that might be imposed. What kind of stuff are you seeing now in Seattle that we might see here? Is there something about mandatory structured workouts? Or what have you seen?
Yeah, they've already passed. If you notice on the PowerPoint, they've already passed mandated financing for the delinquent rent. So in Seattle, just yesterday, the days go by so fast now. Our council passed a 6-month mandate to pay rent in portions over 6 months, and then make like a balloon payment at the end of that. And I think we're going to see the state follow up with the same kind of thing. And the thing that we're trying to explain to folks is everybody is already working with their residents on, partial payment. Some commercial providers have let go of rent altogether for the month of March and April and said, hey, we'll take a haircut on the whole lease. We want you to come back when things are switched back on. But the government wants to tell you how those payment plans have to be executed and how and the consequences for you as a provider if you don't keep up. You don't take those payment plans, but they're silent as to what happens if the resident doesn't pay or if the commercial tenant doesn't pay. So that's certainly one thing that we're seeing. We already have an eviction records prohibition that they passed just yesterday as well. So you're going to see people wanting to seal any eviction that happened during COVID-19 so that you can't see that the person was evicted. Of course, it doesn't make any sense because there are not supposed to be any evictions, but we think that that's a foot in the door to seal eviction records entirely. They've done that, I think, in Minneapolis for 3 years. You can't look at eviction.
Well, one thing I want to jump in real quick, because some people may be jumping off, and I just want to let you guys know that we need your help. NBOA needs help, and if you could, 1 month's rent from one unit would go a long way. You can go to NBOA.com, and there's a donate now button, and contribute.
NBOAChicago.com.
NBOA Chicago. I dropped the link in the chat box. Click the link now and see if you can contribute to the cause, because it's an infinite number of possibilities out there, and we're trying to advocate for you, and this is a protracted deal. It's not a one-day shot.
Yeah, if I can just echo what you just said, Tony, before we lose other people. As I said earlier, we have a really excellent team in place. I thought that when we hired a couple of these fellows that we'd be using them for about 10 weeks or 3 months at most. And it's clear that we've got a long-term problem. And it's also clear that a progressive agenda under the name of tenant rights, the kind of stuff that Roger's describing, is still on the table. We got incredibly serious initiatives that are contrary to logic. I don't really understand if you have a 10% set aside on 200 units, that's 20 apartments. If you have a 20% set aside and there's 20 units built. You're going to have far fewer affordable housing units. And it just seems like so many of the proposals out there are really an affront to the kind of growth that's really needed. And that's what Roger is talking about. In order for our city and our county and our state and our nation to get out of the mess that we're digging ourselves deeper into every day, you can't tax your way out of it. It's a philosophy of growth. And as much as Seattle or Chicago or other places talk about the need for social equity, to bring a sense of social equity, it has to be coupled with a strong focus on growth policies and not the type of things that have unintended consequences. And my point is, the other side on these issues are very well organized. We've heard about the movements for, I'll say the words, rent strikes. They use social media, they protest. We need to get ahead of this. And we have to be proud of those philosophies that underscore what we believe in. And we're all in it for the right reason. We want to provide housing for Chicagoans that's safe and secure and now clean. And in order to do this, we need the paid professionals that are assisting us. And that's why we're making the appeal for some money. As Tony said, 1 month's rent of lost rent, if that could go to us, that will help fund the professional staff that we brought on at least through the rest of the year. So thank you for hearing me and Tony out on that. If you have any questions, please reach out to somebody on the NBOA. It's now 7 o'clock, 7:03. Maybe we'll wrap things up with you, Roger.
Yeah, I hope I sent the our brochure about the Center for Housing Economics, which we're trying to establish as a way to support organizations like yours with data and supporting good ideas that are driven by science and good economics rather than by emotion and grabs at power. And then finally trying to change the narrative. And you can check that out if Lauren wants to distribute that. And then I also put in my link to my Forbes column or blog where you can go and read my stuff. I post there about 5 to 10 times a month or so. And then finally, you can always email me and I'll put that in there in case you run into anything that you want to consult with us about. I'm happy to get on the phone with you or exchange emails and share any ideas and stuff that's going on here. I'm always happy to visit with you like this anytime you want me to. I think we are all in a very, very, very difficult time, and supporting NBOA's work to advocate for you is going to be extremely crucial. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for you to begin to communicate to your elected officials about the way this business really works and about how important your residents and tenants and customers are to keeping your business going, and that should be the focus, not punishing you for owning private rental property. So again, thanks for having me, and anything I can do to help in the future, just don't hesitate to call or get in touch.
I got one last question for you, Roger. You had written an article about private ownership of real estate in the year 2030. And you had almost like an apocalyptic vision, but it was tied to the human right, housing is human right vision. Do you know what I'm talking about? I think I got this right. State of housing in the future.
Well, the premise of my thing that I wrote in January of this year is based on everything that's in that PowerPoint, which is that little by little, your ability to effectively manage your private rental property is being eliminated. And what that's going to lead to is a situation that I saw on some listserv that somebody sent me. Somebody threw up their hands and said, "Come and take the keys to my private property. Just take it away. I can't afford to manage it anymore." And I think that that's where we're headed. And I certainly think that that's the design of a lot of the folks that are out there agitating for housing as a human right, is they want to show that the housing, and I've heard our own socialist council members say this, that what's going on with COVID-19 is an example of why private rental housing doesn't work, why we need what they call social housing. And they dropped the IST off the first part, and they call it social housing, which means that it's owned by the government, managed by the government becomes your landlord. And that to me seems a step completely, 2 centuries backward, rather than moving into an environment where people are able to make more choices when, there's a lot of different housing that's being built. So it's a fundamental difference between belief in opportunity and choice and the idea that the pie is finite, and if my slice is bigger, that means your slice is smaller. So we need to work on that as a community and figure out how to counter that.
Well, that's important words, and thank you so much for your time, Roger. Next time we'll see you under good circumstances, and I'll take you out to that restaurant. It seems like there are people in this chat room that know about the restaurant. I'm anxious to go there and not do curbside pickup.
Right.
Okay. Guys, thank you so much. All right. Appreciate it. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Reach out to your affiliate, and if you would like to talk more about supporting the NBOA, and have a really good night. Thank you.